Hello dear friends, this lecture is actually not mine. It comes from a wonderful little article by adjunct professor of law at New York Law School, R.B. Bernstein. And it is on the American experiment, which is I have titled it. And it will go over the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, and then the amendments of the Constitution. It is a brief primer and an introduction to the wonderful democracy of the American Republic. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the introduction. The Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, the central document of American political life, codifies the American political creed. To understand it, however, we must know its origins and purpose. The Declaration was the last American word in the argument between Great Britain and its American colonists. In 1763, the British Empire, the most successful and the freest the world had seen, had no more loyal subjects than the colonists of the 13 mainland colonies of British North America. Within 2 years, however, the first stirrings of disagreement between Britain and the colonists began to disturb peace within the empire. 2 years after the end of the French-Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, Britain confronted massive war debts. Convinced that the colonists had a free ride on the backs of British taxpayers, British politicians decided to redress the balance by taxing them. But the colonists protested these taxes as unconstitutional. This controversy put the nature of the British Constitution into dispute. And unlike the United States Constitution, the British Constitution is not one authoritative document framed and adopted at a specific time. It is the mass of laws, judicial decisions, documents having constitutional status, such as the Magna Carta, constituting British government. Because the British Constitution is unwritten, there is an array of understandings of its principles. Two of these marked out the opposing positions between the colonists and Britain. The colonists saw the British Constitution as a restraint on arbitrary power. Each of its three major institutions, the Crown, the House of Lords, and the House of Commons, had the power to check the other two. Arbitrary, unchecked power went beyond actual tyranny to include potential tyranny. When Parliament made laws for the colonies as the Empire's supreme authority, it was acting arbitrarily. In particular, taxation without representation was tyranny. Parliament could not tax the colonists because they could not vote for members of the House of Commons. Only the colonial legislatures could tax the colonists. By contrast, the British happily gave Parliament its role as a supreme institution in their constitutional system. Parliament had earned this role by defending liberty against the Stuart kings Charles I and James II. Each member of the House of Commons represented not just those who elected them, but also the king's subjects. Under this idea of virtual representation, Parliament could tax the colonists and make laws for them, though they were not actually represented. In arguing with Britain, the 13 colonies, which previously were closer to the mother country than to one another, learned that they had a common cause, defending their liberties. This insight, fostered by the Stamp Act Congress of 1765 and the First Continental Congress of 1774, led them to see themselves as Americans. By 1776, the argument between Britain and the colonies had reached a stalemate. The British were not listening to the Americans and had sent British soldiers to bring the colonists under control. The reality of war, which began at Lexington and Concord in 1775, opened American minds to the idea of independence from Britain. That January, Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, offered a powerful case for independence. Beginning by demolishing monarchy, the last linchpin of the American loyalty to Britain, Paine showed that the Americans deserved independence and could win it, persuading hundreds of thousands to see independence as legitimate and desirable. 4 months later, in May of 1776, the Second Continental Congress directed the colonies to frame new constitutions to replace their colonial charters. Americans' commitment to liberty, the core principle of constitutionalism, was pushing them out of the empire. Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced 3 resolutions in the Second Continental Congress, the first declaring that the colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. On July 2, 1776, Congress adopted those resolutions. 2 days later, it adopted a declaration draft by Thomas Jefferson, setting forth the Americans' case against George III and for independence. The Declaration looks in two different directions at once. It looks backward, as the last American word in the argument with Britain, and forward, charting the future political development of an independent America. It indicated George III, or indicted George III because the king had spurned his last chance to avoid a breach with the colonies. Its framed preamble was key to its case against the king. Its citing of inalienable rights and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness formed the basis on which Americans could invoke the right of revolution against the tyrant George III. And yet, the Declaration's preamble also states the principles on which Americans would build their constitutions and political systems and govern themselves. Americans have continued to invoke the Declaration to advance the cause of democracy, equal rights, and individual liberty at home and around the world. Thus, the document by which the Second Continental Congress justified declaring independence found a life of its own as a cultural, political, and constitutional symbol, eclipsing the act it was actually intended to explain. The Articles of Confederation. Just as it took time for the Americans to break with Britain, it took time for them to see themselves as, in Alexander Hamilton's words, in The Federalist, number 85, quote, a nation without a national government, end quote, and take steps to remedy that defect. In the process, they had to prepare the political ground for governmental reform, and to devise mechanisms and institutions that they wanted to assemble as a new national constitution. Beginning in the year 1776, Americans launched a series of experiments in state constitutional making. The fruits of those experiments guided latter efforts in devising and amending constitutions, including in 1787, framing the United States Constitution. But in 1776, few Americans felt that they needed a national government. For one thing, they recalled the failure of the British Empire. For another, they were devoted to a body of principles called republicanism. Americans wanted republican government, which meant no king and no nobility, the people, the ultimate source of legitimate power, could and would exercise it through their elected representatives. But conventional wisdom taught that a republic could work only with a small population and a small territory. Thus, it seemed unlikely that one government over all 13 states could survive and preserve liberty. In July of 1776, when Congress adopted Lee's resolution for independence, they also adopted his other resolutions. The first authorized negotiations with such European powers as France and Spain. The second called for Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. On November 15th of 1777, after a year of argument, Congress sent the Articles of Confederation to the states. The Articles created a one-house Confederation Congress, with each state having one vote. Most issues required a majority, and such matters as treaties needed a two-thirds vote. All 13 states had to ratify any proposed amendment. The Confederation had no independent executive or judiciary, no power to raise revenue, and no power to operate directly on individuals. How would the Confederation be financed? Because the Confederation Congress had no taxing power, it had to ask the states for money, with each state's share based on the value of its lands. The states were to collect taxes and send the proceeds to the Confederation. Americans distrusted a strong central government, especially one with taxing power. They were fighting a revolution against one such government and were leery of trusting another. Also, Congress, caught up in the revolution's fervor, believed that faith in the cause would spur the states to do what they were asked to do. It took nearly 4 years for all 13 states to ratify the Articles. Under the Articles, however, the United States established relations with the Netherlands, France, Morocco, Prussia, and Spain, borrowed money abroad to help finance the war, and fielded a continental army that won the war. Its diplomats won the peace, negotiating the Treaty of Paris in 1783, under which Britain recognized the American independence and gave the United States all territory between the Allegheny Mountains and the Mississippi River. The Confederation's greatest domestic achievement had to do with those western lands. Some states claimed these lands based on colonial charters, but their claims overlapped. Other states which had no land claims represented that landed states had a chance to make windfall profits by selling land to settlers and investors. The landless states refused to ratify the Articles of Confederation until the landed states transferred their claims to the United States so that the nation could reap this windfall. The next problem was governing these lands under territorial ordinances that Congress adopted in 1784, 85, and 87. These lands were organized as territories to be admitted to the Union as new states on an equal basis with the original 13, with rules for organizing local government and for public education. Slavery would not be allowed north of the Ohio River, the Northwest Territory. Thus, Congress abandoned the old model of colonialism, a mother country governing territories as colonies only in its own interests. Despite these successes, the Articles had fundamental weaknesses that threatened the Union. Also, state economic and political problems which the Confederation could not resolve threatened the American experiments in government. The Treaty of Paris pledged Americans to honor debts owed to British or loyalist creditors, but the states ignored these promises. Angered, Britain refused to withdraw from the Western territories. Also, Britain, France, and Spain limited trade with the new nation, which could not retaliate or force the lifting of these limits. Third, Spain controlled the lower Mississippi, strangling American settlements unless American settlers swore allegiance to Spain. Again, the United States was powerless to resist. The Confederation had repeated difficulties with the states. They rarely paid what they owed the Confederation in full or on time. Some never paid at all. They also ignored treaties with Indian nations. Many states failed to send delegates to Congress, often leaving Congress unable to function. The Confederation could not force states to meet their obligations, and it could not amend the Articles to give Congress more power. States disputed boundaries, argued over fishing rights, waged trade wars against one another, imposed tariffs on the goods imported across state lines, all to bolster their own economies at their neighbors' expense. Also, settlers in frontier regions of New York, Virginia, Massachusetts, and North Carolina tried to found independent states, and Congress could not help resolve these disputes. Most alarming, however, turmoil between debtors and creditors convulsed many states, a problem worsened by the economic downturn of the mid-1780s. Hardest hit were farmers who lived from harvest to harvest and could be ruined by one bad year. In Rhode Island, for example, battles between debtor and creditor parties led to rapidly changing state laws such as paper money laws that helped debtors but hobbled interstate commerce and seemed to nervous creditors to attack the rights of private property. Where debtors could not win relief through politics, they rebelled against what they saw as heartless creditors and an indifferent judicial system. The most famous debtors' rebellion was Shays' Rebellion, which began in western Massachusetts. Outbreaks of debtor violence spread beyond that state to Vermont and Virginia. By some estimates, 1/4 of the armed men of New England took part in Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shays, a former captain in the Continental Army, was more a symbol of revolt than an actual leader of the rebellion. He was a debt-ridden farmer who struggled to keep a roof over his family's head. In January of 1787, Massachusetts authorities, with the help of the Continental Army, put down Shays' Rebellion, but its lessons lingered. The making of the Constitution. In the mid-1780s, Americans who thought in national terms argued that the problems plaguing the Confederation required a revolution in government. They revived the political process that between 1765 and 1776 had created the Revolutionary Movement. In 1785, at the Mount Vernon Conference, delegates from Virginia and Maryland settled boundary disputes and navigation rights. Virginia then proposed a convention to meet in Annapolis, Maryland, in September of '86 to solve national commercial problems. Only delegates from Virginia, New York, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey showed up at the convention, but they seized the chance to redefine the American political agenda. They proposed a new convention to meet in Philadelphia in '87, quote, to render the constitution of government adequate to the exigencies of the Union, end quote. On February 21st, 1787, the Confederation Congress endorsed this proposal, but its more limited resolution stressing revision of the Articles clashed with the convention's mandate. Of the 74 delegates from 12 states, Rhode Island refused. Only 55 showed up at the convention at some point. Some of the greatest American politicians were not there. John Adams was American minister to Great Britain. Thomas Jefferson was American minister to France. John Jay was the Confederation's secretary for foreign affairs in New York City. Patrick Henry stayed in Virginia because he was uninterested in national politics, although he later claimed, "I smelt a rat." 5 kinds of delegates attended the convention. National heroes George Washington of Virginia and Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania brought prestige, guaranteeing that Americans would give the convention's proposal a fair hearing. But theorists of government, such as James Madison of Virginia, James Wilson of Pennsylvania, and Alexander Hamilton of New York, brought ideas that the convention would use to frame its proposals. Elder statesmen, such as John Dickinson of Delaware and Roger Sherman of Connecticut, brought their experience, and advocates of local interests, such as William Patterson of New Jersey and Luther Martin of Maryland, spoke for the state's concerns. Most delegates, such as John Blair of Virginia and Jacob Broome of Delaware, became raw material for consensus and compromise. From May of 25th through May 28th, the delegates elected their president, George Washington, and their secretary, William Jackson of Georgia, and adopted rules. From May 29th, when Edmund Randolph of Virginia proposed the resolutions known as the Virginia Plan, to June 14th, the large state delegates prevailed on nearly every issue. The Virginia Plan outlined a national government with supreme legislative, executive, and judicial branches. On June the 15th, the small state delegates counterattacked, backing William Patterson's New Jersey Plan, which was nothing more than a reworking of the Articles of Confederation, giving Congress more power. On June 19th, the convention reaffirmed the Virginia Plan, but large state delegates and small state delegates battled still for weeks over representation in Congress. Small state delegates fought for equality of states in Congress. Large state delegates demanded representation based on population. This conflict lasted through July 16, when the convention adopted the Great or Connecticut Compromise from July 19th to July 26th. The delegates pored over the plan, tinkering and adjusting, and then recessed for about a week. During the recess, Randolph prepared the Constitution's first draft, drawing on Wilson's advice. The delegates reconvened on the 6th of August. For the next 5 weeks, they tackled the problem they had postponed, such as devising a method for choosing the president and vice president. They also adopted compromises to appease the slave states. From September 10th to September 12th, the Committee of Style and Arrangement drew up the Constitution's final draft, assigning this task to Governor Morris of Pennsylvania. From September 12th to the 17th, the delegates moved through the last stage of revision. On the 7th of 1787, 37 of the 40 delegates voted to adopt and sign the Constitution and send it to the Confederational Congress. No group at the convention got its way, however, especially not the theorists of government. Senior statesmen warned them that they were going too far and too fast. Local politicians demanded fairness for state interests, and architects of compromise set their ideas aside. Nothing is more fatal to theoretical purity than the spirit of compromise. The convention made a vitally important shift from devising the best constitution possible in theory to devising the best that had a chance to be adopted. What kind of document did this process produce? The Constitution creates a government of 3 branches with limited but generous grants of power to operate directly on individual citizens. The House of Representatives represents the people, and each state has equal representation in the Senate. The President is elected indirectly by an electoral college, mixing national and federal elements. His powers largely undefined, strike a balance between the good example of George Washington and the bad example of George III. The Constitution leaves the federal judiciary structure to Congress. Although it includes compromise clauses dealing with slavery, the words slavery and slave appear nowhere in the document, because the framers hoped that future generations would find a solution to slavery, or that slavery would die out. The amending process codified in Article 5 is easier to work than was Article 13 of the Articles of Confederation. The Article's 6th Supremacy Clause makes the Constitution the supreme law of the land and empowers federal governments to interpret it as part of their duties. Finally, because of fatigue and the belief, as Roger Sherman said, that it would be unnecessary, the original Constitution lacked a Bill of Rights. That turned out to be a fateful decision. Article 7 set forth the process for adopting the Constitution. Each state would elect a ratifying convention. If 9 of the 13 state conventions, or 2/3, ratified it, it would then go into effect as the new government of the United States. 2/3 was easier to achieve than the unanimous consent required by Article 13. Also, the ratifying conventions were more likely than the state legislatures to consider the Constitution on its merits. The legislatures, jealous of their power, would resist any attempt to shift power to the general government. Finally, because the Constitution would be the government of the American people, only they, not the states, had the power to form such a government. On the September 26th and through the 28th, of 1787, the Confederation Congress debated the Constitution. Its opponents failed to persuade Congress to rewrite it or to reject it as exceeding the convention's power, and its supporters failed to get Congress to endorse it. Instead, Congress silently forwarded the Constitution to the states, thus implying that the Constitution was legitimate. The ratification controversy was the Supreme's display of the American political creativity. It operated on two interacting levels. On the formal level, the Confederational Congress sent the Constitution to the state legislatures, which called elections for ratifying conventions, which deliberated on ratifying the Constitution. On the informal level, a vigorous argument over the Constitution raged through the nation, in newspapers, pamphlets, broadsides, and rallies. The informal argument may have been the more important level, for it launched the American constitutional discourse, the ongoing shared argument among the people about the Constitution's origins, significance, meaning, and applications, and helped to create a national political community, focusing the people's attention on the political element of their national identity. Who supported the Constitution under the name Federalists? Who opposed it, known to posterity as Anti-Federalists? Some scholars argue that rich people tended to support the Constitution and poor or the working class people tended to oppose it, or that city dwellers supported the Constitution and farmers opposed it. Both these distinctions fail, however. Modern scholars have suggested that the national issue of ratification interacted in each state with pre-existing divisions of state politics to produce a crazy quilt of shifting alliances and loyalties. They focus on tracing links between anti-federalist and federalist understandings of politics and society and their positions on the Constitution. Anti-federalists insisted that the convention exceeded its mandate by writing a new constitution instead of revising the articles. Federalists retorted that Congress and the states had accepted the Constitution's legitimacy. Thus, the issue was moot. Also, in the Federalist number 40, James Madison invokes the right of revolution in the Declaration of Independence. He pointed out that a government too weak to safeguard the revolution was as threatening to liberty as a government that might be too strong. Second, the two sides disagreed on the nature of the Union and the relationship between the Union and the states. Anti-Federalists feared that the general government would swallow up the states, destroying the people's right of self-government. Federalists, citing the history of the Confederation, insisted that the states would infringe on the general government's powers, as they had with the Confederation. Also, they urged that only a government at least as strong as that outlined in the Constitution could protect the general good and the people's liberties. Otherwise, the Union would break into separate confederacies, which some Federalists charged was what Anti-Federalists had in mind. Denying that they wanted to break up the Union, Anti-Federalists insisted that even if the Confederation was too weak to safeguard American interests, the Constitution was still too dangerous. Third, Anti-Federalists denounced the Constitution's system of representation as inadequate. They mocked the House of Representatives and the Senate as too small by comparison with the large state legislatures. They argued that this unjust scheme of representation would limit service in Congress to powerful, wealthy men. Federalists retorted that the Constitution's scheme of representation was designed to choose men of enlarged views, who would grasp the nation's interests. Moreover, reapportionment would expand the House beyond its original size. Finally, Congress's powers were limited to avoid infringing the people's rights and the state's legitimate powers, yet extensive enough to safeguard the general good. Anti-Federalists, distrusting the presidency, charged that the president was not accountable, that impeachment was too difficult to use against him, and that he would work to ensure his repeated re-election for life. Federalists retorted that the president would be accountable because he would not hide behind advisors, that his brief term of office would not make him a king, and that the Electoral College would choose the best man for the position. Anti-Federalists denounced federal courts as unnecessary and expensive. They worried that federal courts would swallow up state courts, wiping out distinctions between state laws and leaving the people subject to a tyrannous federal bench. They also decried the lack of trial by jury in civil cases. In response, Federalists justified the federal judiciary as a bulwark of liberty that would defend the Constitution against unconstitutional acts of the national legislature or executive and vindicate the Constitution and the general government against encroachments by the states. Anti-Federalists found the Constitution's lack of a Bill of Rights their most powerful argument. Even many who backed the Constitution objected to its lack of a Bill of Rights. Thomas Jefferson scolded Madison, quote, "A Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth, and what no just government should refuse or rest on inference." End quote. Federalists argued that a Bill of Rights was not needed because the Constitution gave the federal government a power over rights. He also noted, as Alexander Hamilton insisted in the Federalist number 84, that the Constitution itself was a Bill of Rights. But aware that they were vulnerable on this issue, they began to rethink their position. Federalists praised the Constitution's amending process in Article 5. It would be easier to use than Article 13 of the Articles of Confederation, but it would also bolster the Constitution as a fundamental law that should not be lightly altered. Article 5's blend of national and federal elements, as James Madison noted in the Federalist number 39, proved that the Constitution would neither destroy the states nor be at their mercy. Other issues came up as well. Anti-Federalists objected to the clause authorizing a permanent capital, which would become a citadel where the people's enemies would shelter themselves against the people's wrath. Federalists highlighted the humiliating journeys of the Continental and Federation Congresses from city to city during and after the Revolution. A new nation required the stability of a permanent capital. New England anti-Federalists denounced the Constitution's ban on religious tests for voting or holding office, fretting that a Jew, a Turk, or an infidel would become president. Federalists extolled this ban as a bulwark of religious liberty. Anti-Federalists in New England also denounced the Constitution's slavery clauses, but Southern Federalists praised them. The Constitution's amending process played a vital role in its victory. At the outset, some anti-Federalists insisted that the Constitution had to be amended before they would accept it, drafting lists of previously amendments. Other anti-Federalists were willing to adopt the Constitution, but only with added conditional amendments. By contrast, Federalists insisted that the Constitution had to be adopted or rejected without amendments. In February of 1788, the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention found a sensible compromise. Anti-Federalists would prepare a list of recommended amendments to be sent to the first Congress to meet under the Constitution, and Federalists pledged to back such amendments. This device of recommended amendments became the key to the Constitution's victory. All states after Massachusetts, except Maryland, added lists of recommended amendments to the resolutions of ratification. These lists were the raw material from which Madison drew his list of proposed amendments that he offered in the House of Representatives of the First Congress on June 8, 1789. 10 of those amendments were ratified in 1791, which became the Bill of Rights. And so I hope you've enjoyed this section. This section is on constitutional change. Americans have shaped their lives through law, and for more than 200 years, the Constitution has been the core of the nation's law. We make many demands on the Constitution. It sets forth our government structure, allocates powers and duties among our public institutions and officials, and defines our rights and responsibilities. Just as important, the Constitution declares the nation's central principles, the goals for which we came together as a nation, the purposes of its grants of power and limits on power, and the kinds of public and private lives that we want to foster on its protection. The Constitution changes over time in 3 major ways. The most sweeping is formal constitutional change, using Article 5's amending process to add provisions to the Constitution. Formal constitutional change alters the document's form by a method of lawmaking more formal and difficult to use than ordinary lawmaking. To become part of the Constitution, a proposed amendment must win a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress, and then be ratified by a 3/4 of the states, 38 out of 50. More than 12,000 amendments have been proposed since 1789, but Congress has proposed only 33 to the states, and only 27 have been adopted. There are 28 amendments now. Constitutional amendments fall into one of 3 categories. The first group, such as the first 10, the Bill of Rights, protect the fundamental principles of liberty and self-government. Some, the Civil War amendments, 13, 14, and 15, extend protections of liberty in ways either not imagined by the Constitution's framers and ratifiers or developing their efforts. The second group, such as that providing that senators be elected by each state's voters, the 17th Amendment, or the Voting Rights Amendments, 15, 19, 23, 24, and 26, expands democracy as a core component of the constitutional system. And the third group, such as those dealing with the Electoral College, presidential terms of office, and presidential succession and disability, Amendment 12, 22, and 25, repairs defects of the original Constitution or responds to problems not envisioned by the Constitution's framers and ratifiers. The second way of changing the Constitution is judicial interpretation. Courts must apply the Constitution's provisions to changing times and circumstances. That is why Edmund Randolph, who prepared the first draft of the Constitution in August of 1787, wrote that he had to draft the Constitution in general terms. Such powerful phrases as commerce among the several states, freedom of speech, cruel and unusual punishment, and equal protection of the laws change meanings over time. As new problems arise and people devise new responses to old problems and new problems, each branch of the federal government and state and local officials must interpret the Constitution, but our system gives special weight to the interpretations set forth by federal courts, especially the United States Supreme Court. Some of the pivotal moments of American history have come when the Supreme Court has had to interpret the Constitution to deal with a divisive issue or to resolve a controversy between the other branches of government. For example, in 1857, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney seized the opportunity to interpret the Constitution authoritatively to resolve issues concerning slavery. In Dred Scott v. Sanford, Taney ruled that the federal government had no power to limit slavery's spread into the territories. The public outcry over this decision helped to bring on the Civil War 4 years later. In 1954, in Brown v. Board of Education, Chief Justice Earl Warren declared for a unanimous Supreme Court that racial segregation violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Just as Dred Scott had long been considered the low point of judicial interpretation of the Constitution, Brown has long been considered a high point. And in 1974, in United States v. Nixon, Chief Justice Warren E. Burger ruled for a unanimous Supreme Court that President Richard Nixon had to obey a federal court's order to turn over tape recordings of private meetings with key aides as evidence in the Watergate investigation. This decision, upholding the principle of rule of law against the sweeping claim of presidential authority, helped to force Nixon to resign office. So here we see that there are certain times in which some of these pivotal moments where the Supreme Court has had to interpret the Constitution to deal with a divisive issue. Sometimes it has been positive, sometimes it has been negative. Customs and usages grow up around the Constitution, helping to guide its day-to-day workings. Political parties are not mentioned in the Constitution, but they have become essential to the workings of the elected branches of government and to the conduct of elections. So too, federal courts recognize executive privilege, the principle that a president's confidential discussions with his aides should stay confidential in most circumstances, but not as in United States v. Nixon, when records of those discussions may be essential to investigate alleged crimes. These three forms of constitutional change work together in a complex series of interactions, but they all help to maintain the American constitutional system's ability to respond to new circumstances and conditions. Thank you. I hope you have enjoyed a brief introductory history on the American experiment. The Declaration of Independence, Articles of Confederation, the United States Constitution, including the Bill of Rights, and the amendments to the Constitution. Thank you.